All right, if you would be making your way in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 18. It's kind of been a while since we've been in 2 Samuel due to us being out of town, gospel meeting. I think it's been about 3 weeks or so. So now I know, of course, that today is Father's Day, so it just happened to be the case that we're going to talk about a very sad situation this morning that involved a father and his son, right? David and Absalom. So again, keeping everything in mind that we've sort of talked about within this account of the relationship between Absalom and David, remember that Absalom had been upset because David did not properly punish his other son, of course, because his other son raped his Absalom's sister. David did nothing about it. Absalom got mad, launches his own rebellion over the course of time, takes over the throne, and Absalom is in the process of trying to figure out how do we get rid of David. And for Absalom's perspective, right, he's trying to think about how do I make sure that I maintain my position as king of Israel. And so in order to do that, Absalom goes along with the advice that we've got to capture David, perhaps even kill David as a result of that. Well, we noted in chapter 17 that Absalom had to deal with the advice of Ahithophel and the advice of Hushai. He ultimately sides with Hushai, and basically that's going to be very important when we get to chapter 18, especially the first part of this chapter, because this is going to be very helpful for David to be able to fight against, or at least David's men to be able to fight against Absalom, because of the time that was sort of given to him by Hushai's advice. And so we're going to try to get down through, at least down through verse 17 today. We'll see if we get that far. But beginning in verses 1, and let's read verses 1 and 2. Says that David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. Now, again, why was it important for Hushai to bide time for David? Well, the reason why that's important is because of what David is able to do in verses 1 and 2. If Absalom had gone straight away and attacked David, as what Ahithophel's advice was, David doesn't necessarily have the time to regroup, get his men ready for battle. Because, again, Absalom and his men come upon, or at least Ahithophel with Absalom's men, come upon him so quickly that he's not able to sort of prepare the army, right, to defend themselves. Well, because Hushai has, or at least because Absalom has listened to Hushai's advice, this bought time for David. And the effects of that is what's being explained here in verses 1 and 2. While this is sort of what we might think of as just sort of a trivial detail that's being given here, the importance of it is to show that because Hushai's advice worked, David had time to prepare his men, and that's going to be very important when it comes to how they are going to fight against Absalom. Again, remember that David had prayed back in chapter 16, prayed to God and said, God, turn the advice of Ahithophel into foolishness. But we know, of course, that God was with David, as we've seen, and this is how that foolishness, or at least this is how the counsel of Ahithophel was turned into foolishness. Absalom rejected it, gives David time to prepare. That's going to be very important when it comes to the outcome of this battle. So David is basically getting his army in order, verses 1 and verse 2. Notice in verse 2 that he divides it out basically into 3 main, what we might call companies. One of the companies is under the hand of Joab. Again, this is David's longest, most trusted military advisor. Although Joab has his fair share of problems, as we again will see within this chapter. Not only that, but he's also divided it up with Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, right? So remember that Joab and Abishai are the nephews of David, right? Because Zeruiah was one of David's sisters. So these are his nephews. Notice, of course, that Abishai is also not just referred to as the son of Zeruiah, but also referred to as Joab's brother. Now, while that may not seem very significant to us, the indication is that there's a lot of emphasis being put on what Joab's role is in this situation between what's going to happen with Absalom, which, again, we'll see that in a moment. Notice that the other third of the military or the other third company, we might say, is put under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. Now remember that Ittai the Gittite was, from our understanding, perhaps not one of the native-born Israelites who you would have expected to be loyal to David, but he was one of the individuals that was, from our understanding, not a native-born Israelite who we saw went and sided with David when David had to flee from Jerusalem. Ittai was a part of that traveling company, and thus his army split into 3 different companies, which, at this time was not a very uncommon way of fighting a battle. I know wars today are fought a lot differently, but back then this is not a very uncommon way of fighting a battle. Now note that David wants his role to be, I want to be there with you, right? The king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. Now, of course, David, in his mind, all these people are perhaps going to die on my behalf. It's only fitting that I should be there fighting with them. And David, like any type of leader, wants to be the individual to lead the way. Now, remember that Absalom sided with Hushai's advice in part because Hushai said, Absalom, you need to be there because you're going to get the glory of victory if you are there and present. And this is a good point here where we can contrast a father and son when it comes to the concept of pride because of what Absalom and David's decisions are about going out to battle. Absalom wants to go out to battle. That's why he acts on Hushai's advice. David likewise does want to go out to battle, not necessarily for his own military glory, but perhaps because he feels obligated to do so. These are men that are about to go and die on the behalf of David. David feels that it's only fitting for me to go out there myself. So, I also will surely go out with you myself. I'm not a coward. But now notice what the people say in verse 3. But the people answered, you shall not go out, for if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in the city. And here David's men have a very good understanding about what's going on, right? Absalom's not necessarily, at least in their mind, Absalom's not necessarily concerned about David's men as he is concerned about David and capturing David and perhaps killing David so that he can sort of solidify his place as the king of Israel. That's what he wants. But notice that the people sort of understand that as well, right? David, you shouldn't go out, right? Doesn't matter if we flee away. It doesn't matter how many of us die. They don't really care about that. The thing that is most valuable to them is capturing you. And the indication that the people that the men of David are giving here is that, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that they don't capture you. So the point being is, David, don't go out there and fight, right? They're not concerned about whether David's a capable general or whether he's courageous or not. They already know that. But their perspective here is, we're all going to die if that means keeping them from getting to you. Because you are what's valuable, right? You are worth 10,000 of us now, because their ultimate goal is again to capture David. So instead, David, stay back in the city. Now I think this is the natural comparison here between father and son, because remember that Absalom loved Hushai's advice. He loved the idea of going and getting the glory in terms of beating David and being there when victory was accomplished. David, in his own mind, recognizes, yes, I am valuable. I can be valuable to the city. But when you think about it from the perspective of pride, David's not going to get the same sense of victory or the same publicity about it if he's in the city when the victory occurs on the battlefield. And David, if you think about it, David here in his own mind has a real concern, has the real temptation about being prideful and saying, no, I'm going to go out into battle anyway. But again, notice what David says, verse 4. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Whereas we see Absalom's pride is going to get in the way that leads to his downfall, David, on the other hand, because he takes the less, what some might say, the less noble position by not being in battle, by being in the city where the fighting's not occurring, because he takes that role, in a way, a sort of a sense of humility being given there, David's going to be the one that's standing at the end of this chapter, and not Absalom. So there's a really good contrast here between the attitudes of a father and son. Absalom, as a younger man, still is, deeply concerned about his own pride. What do people think about me? David, on the other hand, notice here that, if they think it's better for him to stay in the city, whatever seems best to you, I will do. Right? David's not concerned about his own pride or receiving glory for himself, and this is a good passage to illustrate about why James in James chapter 4 talks about submitting ourselves to God, humbling ourselves to God, because God will lift us up. This is a real physical example, biblical example of this happening. David humbles himself, and that's going to lead him to be the one that's standing by the end of this chapter. So the men leave. David's in the city. Verse 5, now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. All right, here's the crux of this chapter. There is no question about what David has said. David does not whisper this. David does not tell this to David does not just tell this to one of the three generals, we might could say, of this in this battle. Right? David makes it very clear. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. In other words, do not kill him, capture him. And of course, David perhaps is thinking about Absalom here not just being a challenger to the throne or an enemy, but he's thinking about Absalom being his own son. And so naturally, a father who loves his son doesn't want to have to deal with his son being killed. But the indication to us is that all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. This is not something that was being done in secret. Everybody knew what the king's expectations were. Yes, we're going to go out and fight in battle. People are going to die. But we're not going to kill Absalom. That was David's orders. And naturally, the problem will come in when one individual will ignore those orders. But keep those orders in mind. So verse 6, the battle begins. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. You can look in your Bible, Joshua 17, verses 15 and 16. When the Israelites were settling the land of Israel, Joshua in that passage mentioned that that part of the area around Ephraim was heavily wooded. There were a lot of forests there. Which that verse sort of ties in and reaffirms what's being said here. They go out and they fight in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David. Again, here remember that the people of Israel is a reference to those that have sided with Absalom, because remember that Israel has recognized Absalom as king, right? We've already seen that. That's why here that the people of Israel refers to those that are loyal to Absalom, because in a sense he is the one that is on the throne and acting as king. But notice that they were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Now that's a lot of soldiers that are killed in the process of this battle. But it is interesting to note that in verse 8 that there were more people devoured by the woods than that were devoured by the sword. And I was looking through sort of the meaning behind that. And one of the things that I was reminded of is that, you know, a lot of times when it comes to war and battles that are fought, things can get very chaotic. And I know there have been several occasions where a lot of soldiers have died in terms of battle, not because of being shot by a gun or being killed with a sword, but some cases soldiers have died because of things like disease and malnutrition and things like that. But perhaps part of what's going on here is that some of these soldiers are being devoured by the woods because of the chaos of war. You can imagine an army in retreat trying to navigate through the woods. It can be a very difficult thing. A lot of times, if it's a very enclosed situation, perhaps like it was, which forests often are, you get people that are ran over, trampled upon, and that would, again, sometimes will happen whenever an army has to retreat, especially in that day and age. But the servants of David are victorious. But the real focus is verse 9, what happens with Absalom. All right, so then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. And this, of course, would have been another reason perhaps why some individuals died, because of what happens with Absalom here. So Absalom, who is very proud of his status as king, kind of is going to be caught in a very compromised position. Right? He's not going to die necessarily in the glory of battle that some soldiers would often envision at that time, but instead, Absalom's head is caught in the terebinth tree. Now, growing up, I always assumed, and perhaps this was the case, but I always assumed that Absalom was caught by his hair. But based on what this passage tells us, it just simply says that he's caught by his head, which could mean that he's caught by his hair, but from my understanding, that's not necessarily guaranteed. It just says that his head was caught in the terebinth tree. So it could have been that his, sort of like the tree got him around the neck. Nevertheless, the point being is that Absalom is basically defenseless because the mule which was under him went on. Right? He had no way of getting out of that tree. And so a certain man, which we assume this to be one of the servants of David, based on verse 9, goes and tells Joab, Absalom's there hanging in a terebinth tree. And so Joab's response, verse 11, so Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him, and why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. Now, we know Joab was a man that was a great general, but sometimes he did not have the willingness to follow the orders of David. Where else have we seen Joab disregard, or at least disregard the desire of David in terms of military? Yeah, remember that Joab was the one that killed Abner, right? Abner was the leader of Saul's army. Joab had him killed, and remember that he did that without David's knowledge. David did not approve of this, and nevertheless, it didn't stop Joab from going and killing Abner. In some ways, Joab might have been a little bit of a sort of a hothead in this sense. He thought that what he knew was best, and that's what he was going to act on. And that's basically what he tells this servant of David, right? You saw him. There's no doubt about his identity. You know what his position is in regards to David, right? He's a traitor. Why did you not strike him there to the ground? Right? Why did you not kill him? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. Now, I think this says a lot about this particular servant, because he has really, in essence, as we see in verse 12, let's go ahead and read verse 12. The man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Now, I think this says a lot about this servant of David, because he was an individual that was not motivated by money in life. In this case, what mattered to this servant was being faithful to his king's commandment, rather than the opportunity of gaining some type of wealth off of this advantage that he had. Now, 10 shekels of silver, not necessarily a whole lot, but I mean, it's still a considerable amount of money to be given. You know, there's some people in life that do things solely based off of whether or not they're going to make money out of it, or sometimes whether or not what's the profit for them. And I know some people do that when it comes to jobs. I know growing up, I know teaching school, a lot of times my students, when they think about what job do they want in life, a lot of times they're thinking about money, right? What job will pay them the most? And as I've gotten older, I realize that that's not always a great philosophy in life. But in other situations, you know, there are some people in life that will only do things out of, you know, what's in it for them. You know, I saw a video the other day about of a man that noticed a woman's house that was not that her walkway to her house had not really been washed off in a long time. In fact, it was about an hour-long video, but he goes through and he's pressure washing her walkway, and he realizes that the walkway out in front of her house was so dirty that grass had actually covered up the sidewalk. And so he went through and he cleaned all of the. He spent about, I don't know, it's probably several hours just cleaning that lady's sidewalk, and then the sidewalk out beside her house, and then the walkway to her house. He spent all that time cleaning her house and did not charge her anything for it, because he felt like it was a great opportunity to help somebody out. And that was very commendable for that guy to go and do that. He was, I don't know, probably in his mid-20s. But we know that there are people in life that would be in that situation that would not have dared offer to help if they did not know that they were going to be compensated in some way by doing that act. And that's sort of, and the mindset of that guy pressure washing that woman's house is sort of the mindset of this servant here, right? He's not motivated by money in life, right? Doesn't matter, Joab, how much you pay me. 10 shekels, 1,000 shekels of silver. If you gave it to me, you know, I'm not going to take it, because I'm not going to go and kill the king's son, because David has been very specific. No one will touch the young man Absalom. If people kind of had this mindset in life, that, when you do something, if you think about doing something, especially if you're doing something to help somebody out, if we often have the mindset that we're not looking for compensation, or we're not looking for gain for ourselves in the whole endeavor, I think the world in a lot of places would be a lot better. If people were motivated to do the right thing rather than to do the right thing expecting to get compensation for doing the right thing. If that makes sense. The world would be a lot better place if people were motivated to do the right thing, despite the financial gain, despite pursuing after financial gain in that sense. So, verse 13, otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. And that's also the other side to it, right? If I directly disobey the king's commandment and you give me 1,000 shekels of silver, well, guess what? I'm not going to be able to spend that money because I'm going to be dead. The king's going to have me put to death. Just as, remember that the king, David had put to death the man that came and bragged about killing Saul. Right? He knew that David would very well likewise put him to death if he killed Absalom. There's no way for him to cover that up. Well, while this man speaks a lot of sense, none of this sense gets into Joab. Perhaps Joab's like me. He's hard of hearing. His ears are stopped up. Verse 14, then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. Verse 16, or we'll go ahead and stop here. Joab, of course, does not want to listen to this man's, what he has said. Even though this servant of David, who, again, Joab should have known better, because he was one of the commanders, he's put in charge. He does not act on this servant's, on what this servant has stated. Notice that he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive. That's very important here. This is not the case where Absalom has died in the process of hanging there in the tree. The writer is very clear that there is no doubt Absalom was alive until Joab got there and struck him through the heart. And not just Joab, but 10 young men, basically those that were part of sort of Joab's personal bodyguard, they go and they strike and kill Absalom as well, so as to put him to death. Now again, while Joab could say there is good that's accomplished here because the enemy of David has been defeated, it still did not take into consideration the fact that he directly disobeyed the king's orders. To me, there's a lot of parallels here with what Saul tried to do in 1 Samuel 15. Right? Remember that Saul and the Israelites defeated the Amalekites, but they spared Agag. They spared specifically they spared the animals of the Amalekites. Remember that Saul went to try to offer sacrifice as though everything was okay, but Samuel came right to Saul and said, right, everything's not okay. Right? God would rather have obedience than rather have the sacrifices that you are offering. Because while Saul thought that good was accomplished, he didn't do exactly what God said. David's going to be upset with Joab for this same reason. Joab has killed David's enemy, but Joab has directly disobeyed what the king's commands are. So, verse 16, Joab blows the trumpet. The people return from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now notice in verse 16 that once Absalom is killed, the servants of David stop pursuing after the Israelites who had sided with Absalom. And of course the reason for this is this avoids further bloodshed. right? Because again, the Israelites, even though they side with Absalom, are still the brethren of David. So no need to pursue after them to try to completely destroy them. They do take the body of Absalom, they cast him into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. So he doesn't necessarily get perhaps the proper burial that royalty would, again being the king's son, but there is a marker that is given, or that is placed where his body is located. But the end result is Absalom is dead, and at this point all Israel has fled, everyone to his tent. It's sort of the death blow then to the rebellion against David. Now we're given this final note in verse 18. It says, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument." So this is in conjunction with what we have just read. Absalom has no offspring. And so as a result, the only way that he felt that he would be remembered is by creating this pillar for himself. And if you're, and I know all of y'all, most of y'all in here are parents, you probably can some way relate to Absalom here. A lot of times you look at your kids and your grandkids as sort of the legacy that you leave behind, right? They're your offspring or they're your grandchildren. And while, you will eventually die and pass on, you'll have offspring that will remember you, that will think fondly of you. But Absalom, again, didn't have that. Again, he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And so it's sort of a sad thing for Absalom that the only way that he felt he could be remembered is trying to set up a monument for himself, because he would never have any children to look back in their lives and to think fondly after him. To me, it's kind of a sad statement that is given here in verse 18. But the end result is Absalom, the rebellion has been put down, but Absalom dies in the process because Joab directly disobeyed the king's commandment. All right, now we're going to stop here, but I know we've covered a lot. Are there any comments that you would like to add on before we close this morning?
I think you got a great contrast between David and Joab, and from the standpoint of leadership. David listens to people under him who he wants to go to war, and he listens to the people who say don't go. And that's the mark of a good leader, to listen to folks under you. Joab, on the other hand, he's a leader, and of course this fellow reminds him he's not going to harm the king's son, and the implication is you ought not either, but Joab doesn't listen. And he goes right ahead. And so the mark of a good leader, whether it's a boss, president, elder, whomever, you listen to folks under you and you'll make a lot better decisions.
Yeah, I think a lot of times leaders can get into trouble when they assume that they know everything. And they think that that because they know everything, the decisions that they make are always in the best interest of everybody involved. And that's a good contrast, right? David listens to the advice of the people. He stays behind. He's preserved. Joab goes and kills Absalom. And that's something that's going to upset David, because Joab did not listen to the men that were under him. All right, if there are no other comments, we'll just go ahead and stop here. Next week we'll talk, I won't be here next week. I should be at Mantachie. But in 2 weeks, we'll talk about David's response to Absalom's death. And that's where we'll pick up in chapter 18 and verse 19. But again, thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention this morning.